have spent many millions of dollars in our pursuit of saving, so-called saving Afghanistan. Money that could have been spent a lot of different ways, domestically as well. So Alden has unique experience. He has substantial interaction with people in the Department of Defense, and he is the right person to make this presentation. Okay.
Well, I hope I won't prove you to be uninformed on that last subject. I think this is my 5th presentation. I always get really cranked up for doing this. Soon after we withdrew from Afghanistan, came to me and said, would I be willing to do this presentation? And I hemmed and hawed, kicked the dirt a little, and then agreed. A couple of comments, and this is really a repeat from my last presentations. What I try to do is to create a narrative here based on credible information and journalistic sources. I'm not trying for a peer-reviewed scholastic or legal evidentiary truth tale, although I have pretty high standards for my sources.
Do you want the lights out or lights in?
How about for the people online? Do we want the lights out, or is it good? I confess that I do use the Bill Maher approach. For any of you who watch Bill Maher, he frequently will have a session called "I can't prove it, but I know it's true." So I do that. And even when I don't present the truths herein, I try not to make statements that I don't think are provable, or at least represent a credible point of view on in an area where there is some disagreement. A lot of sources. I had to quickly read the brand new book called the Afghanistan Papers, kind of patterned after the Pentagon Papers of an earlier time. My book club read, although it's such a heavy lift, The Silk Roads, that it took us 2 sections to read it. It's an interesting perspective on world history, not written from the Western US and European perspective, but written kind of from the Middle East perspective. And that's an interesting way to look at world history. We are blessed with Wikipedia and a trillion good, credible sources for facts off the internet. I have mentioned Mama's Last Hug and Before the Dawn to you in my earlier presentations, because it's through those books that I have developed a perspective not accepted by all, including my dear wife, about how we humans got where we are in our brains. Thinking Fast and Slow, a book by Daniel Kahneman, on his work with Tversky, I forget his name, on the subject of how irrational we are. I just saw today a piece by Henry Kissinger in The Economist that I would recommend to you all, and of course, lots of others. Okay, how many of you think there are fundamental systemic lessons to be learned from our withdrawal from Afghanistan this last year? And I'm not talking about the superficial jibes that you might want to throw at your political opponents, but I'm talking about serious ones. So I see one hand, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What do you think they are? Remember, we're talking about just the withdrawal process now. We're going to talk about the whole problem of Afghanistan later.
Well, I mean, I think that some people say we should have started sooner. But if we said, if you are an American, you must be out of the country by this date, then we'd say, well, why is it? What's the significance of that date? It's because that's when the country is going to implode. Then it would have been our fault that it imploded. So I think the difficulty of doing anything like that, any kind of, we're going to leave completely at a date, creates that potential problem. I don't think people may have known that the Taliban was going to win. I think a lot of people didn't think they were going to win in a weekend.
Anybody else want to add to that? Sure.
There was a lot of talk about not having Americans in the country registered. And that's something that we could have done without doing what Bill was wanting against.
Seems to me if we're gonna create a conflict, we ought to know how we're gonna get out of it.
So there may be, I'm gonna suggest that that's part of the bigger lessons learned as opposed to just narrowly the lessons learned about the Afghanistan. Rick, I see a hand there.
Yeah, I don't think political will and logistics like a major withdrawal fit well together. If you let something that's as complicated as a major withdrawal be ruled by political whims, you're going to have problems.
Right.
Well, what, if I may,
Well, I'd like to put.
Dave's got a
I'm sorry, go ahead.
what I don't hear is much appreciation for dealing with the volatile powder of the Taliban. And it's like we were totally in control and it was totally up to us. That wasn't the case. We were dancing on a tight wire.
I'm sorry, I didn't really hear Dave there.
I think what he was saying is, we were not really in total control. I mean, the Taliban were a very central force, especially in the boondocks,
Right.
in the rural areas. And my comment is, when on the easy side, withdrawal is never easy.
Exactly. So let's move on to some of the deeper causality for what has been wrought in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, and therefore some of the deeper lessons learned, although we've actually touched on them. Now, I've got here a kind of a primer on Afghanistan, and I perhaps went too deep. You know, when you start working on something, well, I need to get into that, So I'll try to speed through this. And by the way, I've actually tried not to make the same mistake I have made in every one of my other presentations to you, and that is to have 3 hours worth of material. I hope I have that. So I didn't go way back in the Afghan history. I went back to kind of what people call the modern history. The country's been settled since the Middle Paleolithic era, and people that they talk about 50,000 years ago that Afghanistan was settled. It's situated as what's referred to as the crossroads. It was all involved in many military campaigns. Alexander the Great, the Muslim Arabs, the Mongols, later the Brits, the Ruskies, and then us, referred to as the graveyard of empire. The modern Afghan state dates from the 18th century with the Hotaki and the Durrani dynasties. It invaded its neighbor 8 times over the years, seeking to exploit a neighbor they perceived to be rich but weak. And remember, Afghanistan bordered directly India until the creation of Pakistan in 1947. So that long Pakistani border for much of Afghanistan's history was really an Indian border. In the 19th century, Afghanistan became a buffer state in the great game between British over India and the Russian Empire. Britain feared that Russia was going to attack India, fought several wars to maintain dominance in Afghanistan. Then what happened? Anyone ever hear of Bismarck?
Yeah.
And what did he do? United the German nation, took all those little bitty principalities and regions of the fairy tales of our past and combined them into one. And then remember when we used to cry as kids and our mother would say, stop that or I'll give you something to cry about. The unification of Germany gave Russia something to really worry about, as history subsequently proved. And so they quit messing with Britain over India. Became the Kingdom of Afghanistan in 1926, and that kingdom lasted almost 50 years through several kings. But the king was deposed in a coup, and a republic was established in July of 1973. In 1978, after a second coup, Afghanistan became a socialist state. Guess where that's headed now? Eventually precipitating the Soviet occupation to defend the Mujahideen rebels from the north. Remember them? Against the Mujahideen rebels from the north. The Soviet recipe was not well tolerated in Afghanistan, not any better than it would be tolerated here, but just a couple of items, the whole central planning and control over a country that had never been, much of a centralized state anyway. The fact that they were atheists, etc., that was not a marriage made in heaven. As an element of the running Cold War with the Soviets, the US determined to make the Soviets pay for their occupation of Afghanistan. So the US allied with the Pakistani Intelligence Service, the ISI, to support the Northern Alliance in its efforts to eject the Soviets. Guess who was involved in that conflict? Osama bin Laden. And he got support from the US. So you probably heard the assertion that there was a time when Osama bin Laden was receiving American money, and in fact he was. It may not have come from American hands, but it very well could. He developed a warm relationship, I have warm in quotes here, with the Afghanis, creating an obligation that he was later to exploit. And of course, the Saudis, with their Wahhabi version of Sunni Islam, were also involved in funding this effort to eject the Soviets. The 9 years of war during the Soviet period killed hundreds of thousands, and I have hundreds in there because I saw an estimate of 400,000, and I also have seen estimates of over 1 million, and had drastic social effects on the country. The communist regime collapsed in '92. A dysfunctional coalition government attended by anarchy, factional infighting, violence, and extortion took over. The traditional power structure had shifted from clergy, community elders, intelligentsia, and military in favor of powerful warlords. Remember that term. Mostly from the north. You had heavily armed police, private bodyguards, openly armed civil defense groups, and they all became the norm. And that remains the case today, even after the US intervention. The Taliban emerged in 1994 as a movement and militia of students from the Islamic madrasas in Pakistan. Remember who funded the Pastrami madrasas? Anybody remember? The Saudis. And I'm challenging Bill Maher here, or channeling Bill Maher. I can't prove that, but I'm sure that's the case. But because of our need to keep the Saudis solidly in our camp, read Middle East issues going forward, multiple administrations have avoided holding them to account, even before the unnatural acts of our former government. The Taliban took Kabul and the government in 1996 and created the Islamic Emirate. Bin Laden took advantage of the Afghanis based on the Islamic tradition of granting refuge to asylum seekers and his support in ousting the Soviets to move Al-Qaeda there. And I think they came from Somalia. I think that's where they most recently were, if anybody, I would accept correction here. Of course, we then got this September 11th attack, although there were precursors. There were attacks to, I think, a couple of embassies in Africa and other things. The Afghanis then refused to turn him out or turn him over. So, of course, we then had the 9/11 attack, the attack on and the 20-year occupation of Afghanistan and complete withdrawal in 2021. Personally, I doubt that we're completely gone from Afghanistan forever. I think we'll be back in some senses. Okay, geography. How many of you know where Afghanistan actually is? Yeah. So I got this pretty good map. You can see it right there in the Middle East. It's bordered by Iran, a long Iranian border on the west, and even longer Pakistani border on the east, and then all the stands above it. And I have a little bit more for you on that here as we go. Very varied terrain in Afghanistan, but it's mountainous and rugged, dominated by the Hindu Kush, the western extension of the Himalayas. The Himalayas, the highest point is 24,005, which of course is way higher than Mount Whitney, probably of the same order of Denali, not quite as high as Everest, but it's a very mountainous country. Generally arid, receives substantial winter snow, and this is a significant factor here, I think. 2/3 of the runoff flows very directly into neighboring countries. And what that means is that the Afghanis don't have complete control of the water. And you can think what implications that might have. Lots of mountain ridges separating the plateaus and river basins, and we'll speak to that again in its impact on governance and organization. The mountains are very cold in the winter, and the plateaus are very hot in the summer. They've got 7.5 million hectares of arable land. I think a hectare is about 2.5 acres, something like that. But only about half of it's farmed because of lack of irrigation and insecurity. Moving on to demographics. About 40 million people in 2021. Significantly, 74% of those people live in rural areas. And just as a matter of perspective, there are also about 40 million people in Iraq. And 85 million people in Iran. Ethnicity, they are 42% Pashtun. By the way, the Pakistanis are about 20% Pashtun as well. 27% Tajik, Hazara 8%, Uzbek 9%, and a few others. Significantly, the Pashtuns are known as warriors. The Taliban originated among the Pashtuns in southern Afghanistan, always maintained a strong relationship with their fellow tribesmen in Pakistan. The Northern Alliance, with whom the US allied to fight the Russians, was composed of the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, and others from the north. The Hazaras significantly are the distinct underclass. For those of you who read The Kite Runner, if you haven't, The Kite Flyer, if you haven't, it's a wonderful book. But there was some discussion of the fact of the Hazaras as they're the African Americans or the Hispanics or the people who have been the subject of discrimination in our country. By religion, they are 85% Sunni Muslim and 10% Shia Muslim. To channel another one of my personal thought tracks, the Sunnis are the chimps and the Shia are the bonobos.
I don't get that comparison. You help me.
John says he doesn't get that comparison.
I don't know what
Chimps and the bonobos.
Well, I said that's another thought track, and later on I suggest that's another, that needs to be another ADG presentation. Well, so I happen to believe that political and religious belief are buried in our genome in the very low levels of our subconscious. And as a matter of fact, we share a good many of those attitudes, values, and concepts with our very close relatives in the higher aid community. This really is a broader subject, and I'm just kind of making a little joke here. John, you and I will probably have to follow up on this if you're interested. And my wife doesn't throw me out of the house. On to governance. There are 34 provinces, each with an appointed governor or warlord. The tribal and ethnic leaders, there's tribal and ethnic leadership in the provinces under Sharia law. There's essentially no separation of church and state. Significantly no tradition of strong central leadership in the country ever. The economy, 22 billion current in GDP. It's a little hard to look this up because when you're talking about countries who have such disparate economic systems and standards of living, the GDP numbers don't mean the same. The $22 billion in GDP as measured at the world level is really more like 73 billion in the economic context of the Afghanis. As a matter of comparison, Iraq's GDP GDP is about 235 billion due to oil, or as they say in some places further east, Earl. Their economy has been significantly assisted recently by the return of 5 million expatriates after we came in and throughout the Taliban. They brought entrepreneurial and wealth creating skills. Unfortunately, the outflow has already started this year. They take in 7 billion in imports and have 784 million in exports. See a problem there? Yeah. Mostly of fruits and nuts and opium, which is awful. The current accounts deficits are addressed primarily by donor contributions, which of course will help explain the reason why the Taliban has got to quickly try to come to peace with the donor nations because the place cannot survive on its own efforts. Very high levels of corruption, national and government officials and the warlords. It's a classic agrarian economy, one of the least developed in the world. Forgive me here if this is too harsh, but they're stuck 100 or 200 years ago on the relative development trajectory that those of us in the developed worlds have followed. With very few exceptions, they've picked up some more modernity. It's asserted that Afghanistan has got maybe $1 trillion of mineral wealth, including the rare earths that are so important for advanced semiconductors, not yet heavily exploited. The Chinese are in there working that problem really hard. Infrastructure, very primitive road system in the country. Lots of people use donkeys and carts. There's not a lot of cars out there. Much of the road system was destroyed during years of war. The ring road, some of you may have heard of the ring road that connects most of the major cities around the world, is under construction, but if I read this diagram, and I pulled this from the internet without an ability to sharpen it at all, so I'm not sure exactly what it says. I think that blue part is part of the ring road. They have no national rail network. They've got some short connectivity across their borders. 95% of the rural population had electricity by 2018, up from 28% 10 years before. So that really was a success of the American involvement. They have a few dams with hydroelectric generation, but 75% of the electricity is imported from the north. So that's that business of not having enough control over their water. They're actually having to buy the hydroelectric power that's generated from the snow that comes down. There's a gas pipeline from the north under construction. The communications infrastructure was completely destroyed by the war by 2001. By 2016, they had 22 million mobile phone subscribers, 5 million internet users, another modest success. Significantly, 120,000 people working in the communications industry. They have a satellite. AfghanSat-1 provides phone, TV, and internet service, and the major cities have air service from multiple carriers, and there is a national airline. Culture and governance. I guess I got governance in there twice, but culture. Very religious and conservative in the rural areas. Remember that that includes 74% of the population. Strongest Taliban support. Very little penetration of modernity in the countryside. Burqa wearing is still very common. Marriage among first cousins is very common, and it makes a difference whether it's a cousin from your mother's side or your father's side. You know, who knows how they came up with that stuff. It's a tribal, alpha male dominated, misogynistic, not peace-loving, revenge-oriented culture. John, that's also an element of the bonobos versus the chimps. The cities are increasingly cosmopolitan and westernized, especially Kabul, and they had to go through and get rid of a bunch of that stuff as soon as the Taliban came in. I remember a TV program about this. It was essentially a beauty salon, a multi-storefront beauty salon. They went through and painted over all of that stuff and blacked out the windows as soon as the Taliban took over. Let me see. And that's really has been associated with the US and the European presidents over 20 years. And that really made a big difference, you know, and I've got a little bit more about the women's roles and things. That was another place where we made a big difference. But the Taliban is essentially going through and scrubbing out a lot of that already. Let's see, again, we're on culture here. The social governance model is also stuck in the past. Extremely strong conservative religion and a natural affinity for authoritarian government, the warlords. The economy, health, etc., are well behind that of the Western world. Or just about where every other Mideast, where the other Mideast societies were before, and if not for the discovery and exploitation of oil. Literacy and education, Afghan adult literacy was 27% in 2000, up from 18% in 1978. It improved to 43% in 2018. So another element of success. By contrast, the Iraqi literacy rate was 74% in 2000. And that's a major difference. And it also is an indication of why the Iraqi government is more successful now. You know, they just had their 6th, I think, national election, and we probably mostly didn't even hear about it, which is, you know, they've got the process working. The Iraqis also had many more women in positions of authority and in their government, and they're well ahead of Afghanistan on the modernization track generally. There are about 16,000 schools with roughly 9 million students. Unfortunately, in contrast to the Western world, where it's about 50-50 males and females, it's heavily biased in favor of males in the schools. And there's now, the new regime is forbidding girls and female teachers in anywhere above secondary schools. Health, highest fertility rate outside Africa. 6.8% of babies die in childbirth or infancy versus about 3% worldwide. The life expectancy is about 63. It's about 73 worldwide. It's about 80 in Western Europe, and it's 68 in Iraq. You know, the precision of these numbers is probably not within 5%, but you can see the Iraqis are even further ahead on the life expectancy scale. Okay, the American era, disastrously unclear mission after the defeat of the Taliban, and I don't know whether you remember, that was about a 6-week period to kick their butts there. And after that, it was unclear what our mission was, but we would make it lots worse soon after that. The military, and forgive my word here, kind of slumped into a nation-building posture, but lacking a lot of coordination with the civilian agencies. And you know what they say, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I have more comments in here about whether we ask our military to do many things for which they're not well equipped. Sure.
Where does this fit into the Powell doctrine?
Well, the Powell doctrine is why we succeeded in 6 weeks.
All right.
Okay. The rest of it, I'm not sure what Powell would have said about it. At least about using the military for what came next. And I think this next bullet is relevant there, Jim. Since the official US position is that we don't do nation building, and that's largely because of very strong antipathy from the conservatives, from the Republicans, it is kind of our national posture that we don't do nation building. And the priority and funding then tend to oscillate whenever we get in a situation where what we're really doing is nation building, just not calling it that. I told you that I read it in prep for this, the Afghan papers, and those papers were based very heavily on a series of lessons learned that were done Richard Butcher, I think that's how he pronounces his name, from the Department of State was quoted in one of those lessons learned. I'll just read it to you, I guess. If there was ever a case of mission creep, it's Afghanistan. We went from saying we'll get rid of the Al-Qaeda so they can't threaten us anymore, to saying that we're going to end the Taliban and get rid of all the groups that the Taliban works with. We then set an impossible goal: create a stable American-style government with democratic elections, a functioning Supreme Court, an anti-corruption authority, a women's ministry, and thousands of public schools with a modernized curriculum. We tried to build a systemic government a la Washington, D.C., in a country that doesn't operate that way. So you can already tell by my bolding of the text here what one of my lessons learned is going to be from this. We made good progress on some fronts, and some of it was indicated, as I noted above. Unfortunately, in order to keep peace in the place to the greatest extent we could, we tolerated a continuance of the opium trade. And whenever you do that, whenever you do something like that, you know, you have got one of your hands tied behind you. The largest accomplishment, and I put that in quotes, was the creation of a combined military police force, ignoring that the Afghan economy had no chance of affording what it was we put in place. Roughly $200 million a year. You know, that country was not going to be able to afford that. So in some sense, that was a terrible mistake to have done that. By various estimates, it was 200,000 to 400,000 people involved in the Afghan forces, 200 strong or weak, as the exit demonstrated. There was $2 trillion estimated in spending over 20 years. But a central element of the US process was to dump buckets full of money, largely through national and local leadership, the source of much waste and corruption. There was rampant corruption through the society and the government. An example, the Taliban commander blows up a bridge, his brother gets a contract to rebuild the bridge, rinse and repeat, all with US money. A new neighborhood of luxury homes in Kabul sprung up, paid with US funding. You can see ads on the web. Here are a couple of them. And just on the web, just picture after picture after picture of these opulent homes built in this particular neighborhood in Kabul. There was increasing violence against the citizenry, the government, the infrastructure in the US, very little trust in the Afghan government, strong antipathy toward the US, and a poor US focus and prioritization after the Iraqi invasion, which is where I said we would go on to make it lots worse. We went from frontline combat units in Afghanistan to short-staffed National Guard and Reserve units on short tours, 12-month typical tour. Fly in, spend 4 months learning your job, spend 4 months doing your job, 4 months training the new guys, and fly out. Too little familiarity with competence to get things done on short terms. We attempted a construction project where there was no need or without enough time to complete during the unit's short deployment, or was destroyed by the Taliban, a la the bridge metaphor. And then we went back to the approach from Vietnam. Everybody says it's going well and that we're winning. On the short term, the short terms made it very difficult to deliver on sustainable results, and nobody had a stake in the truth. Okay, now it's your turn. How would you characterize Afghanistan as its US involvement came to an end? So, well, let's see, Gene, before what I want to offer you the opportunity to do is to go through, and we'll add on here if you'd like to add comments. Alternatively, we can just jump to what I said. But I think another mistakes I made in the past, besides in addition to bringing way too much material, is that I talk too much. So I'm trying to offer you the opportunity to go through and make some inputs on these on these things if you have strong observations you'd like to offer. What do you think?
I think that 3 or 4 of us leave in about 2 minutes to go to choir practice. So
Okay.
we're not gonna be involved in that.
So shall I just plunge ahead then? Okay. Here's what I put down. Mountainous, arid, rural population concentrated in valleys separated by ridges, water not retained in the country. Demographics, strong tribal structure dominated by warlike Pashtuns, predominantly rural. Governance, alpha male dominated tribal leadership under Sharia law. And I would also observe that Islam hasn't yet been through its reformation, which is one of the things that was significant in the development of Western culture. It's been asserted that the Mideast has many regions stuck in the 7th century. Economy is a low productivity agrarian economy with an awful dependence on opium. It's
Alden, can I stop you there?
Please.
I think your observation about dependence on opium is a very Western view. I mean, I'm trying to take an Afghani view.
Sure.
I'm able to grow a cash crop and survive economically. So what perspective or lens are you looking through? You know, what is the deteriorating or damaging economic aspect of dependence on opium?
Well, it was a benefit in economic benefit in Afghanistan itself, much the same as the cocaine trade was a benefit to Colombia when they were doing it. But the rest of the world can't tolerate that, and eventually something will happen. It's a bad path to be on because there's no good exit, there's no good end to that path, is the perspective I have here. Let's see, infrastructure, they have a primitive transportation and communication networks. Afghanistan needs irrigation infrastructure badly. They put it in a couple of different times, and of course, that's one of the things that's very easy for the rural Taliban to just go in and tear up once it gets put in. Culture, it's a common Mideast Islamic culture without oil. And I'm of the mind that this situation in the Mideast goes deeper than just culture. I've already told you that I'm a nature over nurture guy. I'm persuaded that there's a Middle East genome. Has high intense religiosity, suggesting lesser rationality. I'm not saying that all religious belief implies lesser rationality, but when you go to the extremes of it, you have to give up a lot of rationality to embrace those beliefs. And what I mean by that is there's strong deference to and dependence on a directly intervening supernatural force. Very strong tribal identification with a revenge orientation. I intended to highlight this a little higher. I think one of the significant steps that a population takes as it comes out of the hunter-gatherer primitive is to essentially eschew taking personal revenge for insults, for crimes against you, and agreeing that you're not best equipped to figure out what kind of revenge should be taken. And so what's happened in our society, we don't do personal revenge at all. Essentially, none of the civilized people do. That is a function that we allocate to the government. And I think that's a step that they haven't yet taken. And of course, they are very misogynistic and very authoritarian. And all of this seriously gets in the way of liberal democratic rule of law principles. So this might either be a topic for a different ADG session or one on which I should just shut the hell up. I know what Jamie means. Literacy and education, some progress during the American era, but they got a long way to go. Health, typically there are typically underdeveloped country situations in health. I didn't put anything down for it. Okay, so where does this leave us with our lessons learned?
Can I?
Sure.
So one thing Americans have brought is at least the duration where they were in control is educating girls.
Yes,
Now, is any of that durable?
well, they are still allowing girls to go to school in the lower grades, but not above secondary. So high school and above, no women are allowed, either as teachers or as students.
But have the girls learned something that a decade from now, they'll be far better off than?
Let's see, I believe so. There have already been women's demonstrations in Afghanistan that there wouldn't have been, 20 years ago. So I think it's possible. It's a question of whether they've gotten enough influence and power that they can make some of it stick, or whether they're just going to backslide. I'm hopeful, but I'm not sure. Okay, in case you were confused about my attitude about the withdrawal, I'm going to assert there is no systematic lesson to be learned from the withdrawal, the way the withdrawal occurred from Afghanistan. Almost all data, intelligence, information available to support decisions on matters like the withdrawal are uncertain and described by probability distributions. There are no binary black-white choices on complex issues. And Kahneman and Tversky have done significant research on how terrible we humans are at making decisions under uncertain conditions. We have anybody here who is uneasy about flying? Okay. Are you more or less uneasy about the trip in the car to the airport? Well, the fact of the matter is that for most journeys, and distance makes a difference, that the risk of death or serious injury is as great in the journey to the airport in the car as it is on the flight. But we humans have a very hard time accommodating to that. And that's one of the things that Kahneman and Tversky have worked with. The initial attack after 9/11 was, so that was my first, just an observation. I don't think there's anything specifically and systemic to learn from the withdrawal. The issue has been taken over, it's been captured by the political dialogue in the country. And in case you haven't noticed, we have a values-based chasm that has opened up in our country, approximating that from the 1850s in our country. And once an issue has been grabbed by one side or the other side of that chasm, then there is essentially almost no useful dialogue to be had on that subject. It's now off the table. So that's my first conclusion. The initial attack in Afghanistan after 9/11 was appropriate, and yes, ma'am.
I have a question about that. Why wouldn't it have been better just to have gone after bin Laden and the perpetrators instead of attacking the entire country?
Well, I hope I'm going to address that partially here, but let me come back once I've done this next couple of bullets here. So the initial attack was appropriate and on the mark. This is my conclusion, and it was well done. But we went off track almost immediately thereafter. Our military should be only used when there's a credible threat to the U.S. and not just direct. We belong to NATO, and so as part of our national defense, we belong to NATO, and so if we need to go, assist some other country. So those are appropriately used military force. But any immediate threat to the U.S. disappeared with the Taliban defeat. As soon as they weren't in power anymore and weren't essentially providing a haven, and more appropriately, we were now in the country and so could keep our fingers more on what was happening there. Notwithstanding that we didn't get bin Laden right off the bat. You know, it took us 10 years, but he was pretty much out of the picture soon after that attack had happened. So serious reconsideration of our purpose was in order at that point. Although perhaps it wouldn't have led to immediate withdrawal. Perhaps we would have, instead of sending tens of thousands of more troops in there, we would have kept pockets of security related forces around and led with our civilian and NGO forces to help work on the nation building and any cultural re-education that one might have done there. So I don't think just going after bin Laden with the Taliban still in place would have gotten it done, but you know, maybe this is one of those on the one hand, on the other. Clearly, we made a significant error immediately after that point. The most profound lesson, and one of the reasons why I went through as much of the history that I did, to be learned, is that presuming that we can move a relatively primitive nation with strong cultural impediments into a liberal democratic governance is hubris of the first water. This order of transformation, if possible at all, will require generations. If you think, again, going back to before the dawn and chimps and bonobos, etc., if you think how long that we human beings existed in the same evolutionary environment as the chimps and the bonobos did, compared to how many generations, I did the calculations once, I don't remember, but so thousands and thousands of generations we were in that same evolutionary environment, compared to the number of generations that have elapsed since we left that environment, essentially left Africa and populated the rest of the world. We've had very little time to get to a different genome and a different set of cultures than would have been that we would have had when we were in Africa. Leaving aside for the moment the rationale for the invasion of Iraq, its timing and priority destroyed any chance of long-term success in Afghanistan. I think I already said that, you know, Iraq immediately became the priority and Afghanistan was the backwater. Now going back to the rationale for Iraq, it was even a stronger affirmation of the lesson on hubris that I mentioned above. The presumption at the outset, the administration asserted and believed at the outset that we would go in and install a liberal democracy in Iraq, and then that model would spread naturally and kind of automatically throughout the Middle East. Hubris is not nearly a strong enough word for what was wrapped up there. Yes?
Isn't that what happened? I mean, maybe I don't remember it correctly, but I seem to recall George W. Bush putting out this whole thing about nation building.
Absolutely.
Countries,
Absolutely.
into democracies.
Absolutely.
Okay.
No, we made no other kind of claims. That was exactly what was going to happen.
Should Bush Jr. have listened to Bush Sr.? Bush Sr. would, my assumption is that Bush Sr. was much more accomplished at foreign policy, understanding the world.
Well, I'm not sure I want to mount the chasm here, but I don't know what to say. I'm sure we had people here who, you know, amongst us or online who voted for George Bush, but I think H.W. wouldn't have done what his son did, and the word I've read that he even counseled Bush against George W. against doing that, and I think he believed that Cheney and Rumsfeld were really a bad influence on George W. So the implication, I think, is without making a value judgment of George W., who I will confess was not one of my favorite people, but I think there was a fairly distinct separation between he and his father. Another conclusion or lesson: the U.S. military has no equals. It is the best military in the history of the world. And if we decide to get really serious about it, I don't think there's anybody who can compete with us. But we tend to overuse it, and we tend to use it for things other than those for which it is suited, equipped, or trained to do. And so it was in Afghanistan. As I said earlier, civilians, both from the government and from non-government organizations, could and should have led the reconstruction activities in Afghanistan. Yes, sir.
What is the dollar value of the assets we're preventing the Taliban getting their hands on, and why do you think we'll get involved again?
Well, let's see, I've read the number 85 billion they got, but you know, every time you leave a combat area, you face the choice of, does it make more economic sense to drag the equipment home or leave it? And mostly we leave it. The economics of transporting all of that equipment back just never works out. I've never been involved in those trade-offs myself, but I understand that that's really what happened. Now, what they did is they went through and essentially disabled all the really valuable stuff. I mean, there's no sense in disabling the Humvees, you know, because they could just get, you know, Toyota pickups, you know, so they probably didn't disable any of the kind of the stuff that had other purposes. But, you know, the attack helicopters and all the electronics and all that advanced weaponry, I believe they disabled all of that stuff and disabled it in fairly substantial ways. Okay, any other lessons you are?
I have a question about, currently I heard that our government wants to send humanitarian aid to Afghanistan, and if so, won't it go to all of the warlords and so forth?
We have a culture of war and military. The decision of the Marine, what after that? One unusual incidents like that, we didn't just stand by and say, let's let the diplomats work it out. So we're really enjoying it. I'm not talking about our culture, it's when we talk about Afghanistan.
Well, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this was what would you call this? I mean, this was an invitation for us to demonstrate some of our worst instincts, and we were unable to resist the temptation.
The nice one thing that, according to the new book, what's it called? We just read the book of Carol. The military did improve that from having a military obligation.
I'm sorry, say it again. What's that part?
Well, the military apparently did put some guards around Trump in terms of trying to sort of.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Especially a nuclear confrontation. You know, that's different from going out and having war parties in, you know, underdeveloped parts of the world. You know, it shouldn't be any surprise that if anybody who has kind of soldier of fortune inclinations, and I'm struggling for the word here. You know, jump on your horse and run off and find bad people and beat them up. You know, the temptation amongst individuals, groups of individuals, is strong, and I think you have some of that in the military. The people who rise to the top of the military, and I dealt with some very good, very senior leaders at the top of our military when I was in the government. They're not interested in going off and having fun wars. They're committed, you know, if it's necessary to defend the interests of the United States and our allies, they'll do it. But they're not interested in doing it for fun.
John had something to say, and maybe if you could ask him to speak up on the Zoom.
John?
I think I've heard that our government wants to send humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. But if we do that, won't it just go to all the warlords and the crooks and all that kind of stuff?
I'm sorry, I just walked back here so I could hear you better, John. Can you say it again?
I believe our government is talking about sending humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. And I don't think it's going to get in the right hands if they do.
There is every bit of possibility that that's true, John. But I think, if you look at the alternative, should we not send it? Should we just say, you people,
Well, I don't think it's going to get to the right place. So I'd say, no, don't send it.
Well, some of it will. But I think I definitely think that problem needs to get worked.
Can you tell us what John said?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I should have done that. John said, if we give them aid, it's just gonna go into the same buckets that it went in when the US was there and go into the hands of the warlords, the tribal chiefs, and it'll not get to the right people. So, what do? Do you not send it at all? Do you try to put in more protections against that happening? I'm not sure I know how to do it, but if the country doesn't get aid, it definitely will collapse, completely collapse. And so, you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. And I didn't answer the rest of Ron's question about why do I think we're not completely gone? Iraq or ISIS or somebody with even less or even a more malignant set of attitudes about the rest of the world is already back in Afghanistan. And if we're going to prevent that from gaining momentum and actually creating another 9/11 style threat, we're going to have to be closer. Those of us who build satellites, if anybody knows anybody who might be associated with satellite intelligence, always like to talk about how great all that stuff is, but you really do need to get in close for lots of intelligence questions. So I would suspect there's going to be CIA presence kind of continuously in and around Afghanistan. We just, one of the things we needed there was access on the ground, and so as part of the answer for why did we go in a big way, we needed to get access up close and personal to finish the job. But I think being able to do it at arm's length, what do they call it? The long range, from the outside, that's going to be too hard to do to the level that I think it needs to get done. Yes.
Feels to me like a lesson, even with hands on the ground or whatever, in this country with a pandemic, we can't even get agreement. So I don't know what the solutions are, but we're not even doing such a good job here of getting.
Well, that would definitely be another ADG topic.
Right.
One which I choose not to wade into at this moment. But around national security, we can do that usually pretty well. For example, I believe that an administration, either of the current persuasion or of another persuasion, would still agree that we need to be up close and personal with Afghanistan. So, and I think there would probably even be agreement that some amount of aid needs to go there, and it's not just us. We can't do that on our own. We're going to have the world's, the Western nations, the civilized nations of the world are going to need to provide help there. Or, I hope even my modest efforts here have persuaded you that they don't have a good chance of succeeding on their own from where they are now. Yes,
We only had, I think, I read something like, it was 2,500, maybe 5,000 troops at the end.
mhm.
So we didn't really have that much of a presence, but were we running the country as
No.
opposed to? Okay.
Gosh, no. And as a matter of fact, the only reason that those 2,500, and that's the number that I've heard as well, didn't get handed their heads was because the deal that we made to leave. So they said, okay, if you're gonna go, we're gonna quit attacking you guys. So the people who think that we had the existence proof that we could have stayed there with 2,500 people are ignoring the fact that we had gotten a pass and we weren't being attacked by the Taliban. And they clearly would have changed that had we not done something like leave.
And just one other question, could you define what they mean when they talk about warlords? Because I don't know if that's like tribal chiefs or generals, what are they? Or oligarchs?
All the above. I think, well, let's see, I think, so maybe in the South where the Pashtuns were, it was the tribal chiefs that would have qualified under the warlord category. In the North, where you had the Uzbeks and the Tajiks, etc., they had less of the Pashtun culture. They were different, kind of a different culturally up there, and they had people who were warlike, more warlike than even the Pashtuns were. And you might even remember that right about the time of the 9/11 attack, Bin Laden sent a team up into one of the warlords' territory. Masood, I think, was the family, the tribe, and they assassinated the guy they thought would be most able to mount a threat against them. Anybody have any other lessons they learned from all this? Yes.
Question.
So they had to give an exit date in order to get the Americans to stop being attacked, I guess, because that seemed to be the final nail, because once they announced we're leaving on May 30th or wherever it was, then everybody changed sides, all the soldiers, for their own sake.
Oh, yes.
I mean, have we done that? Is that something we would typically do, is say, okay, we're getting out in 6 months? Or?
Well, let's see, how many times has anybody done this?
Well, that's what I wondered.
It doesn't happen very often, people want to liken it to Vietnam, everybody has an image of the helicopter picking people off the roofs there in Saigon. This is kind of a rare thing that would happen. And again, if you line up 100 variables might determine whether it was successful or not. And there's uncertainty around every one of those variables. So what's the right answer? Who knows? We raised the question with the Afghani government about how should we do this departure? And they asked us not to announce it in advance because that would clearly have precipitated the collapse of the government. They were hoping, as it turns out, I think, hoping against hope that their government would survive. And it just didn't. And if there's any testimonial to the lack of trust that the populace had in their government, the fact that their forces just melted into the countryside at the first word of our departure should tell you that the government had no support.
So let me take it in perspective as a naysayer. What if we just walked away? Figure out how we acted. Why is helping Afghanistan our long-term interest? If you did not help, And then be back.
Well,
Somebody would try to fill the back.
maybe, I would make 2 points, Jim. The first is that while you might disagree that there is a quote a singular American culture right now, there is a fairly strong ethos around trying to help people in need that is around in our country. So, and there are lots of people who I think who have had a hand in what happened in Afghanistan, who are feeling regretful, maybe even a little guilty about it, and would say, you know, we need to step in and help try to clean up this mess. Notwithstanding John Huguenot's assertion that I can't really argue with, that if we give them money, it'll just get into the hands of the warlords. So that's one. The other would be, I think there is a legitimate fear of a resurgence of an Al-Qaeda-like threat within Afghanistan unless we stay close.
Right.
Was there another question from Zoom?
Yeah, I had a question, if you can hear it.
Repeat the question.
Question is about that staying close to keep a follow-on Al-Qaeda development that would threaten the U.S. How do you see the CIA and other either overt or covert activities to suppress the building of another Al-Qaeda?
So the question is, if we're going to have to stay close, forgive me if I wander this a little bit, Dave, if we're going to have to stay close, how do we actually do it with the CIA and perhaps other elements? Well, the obvious answer is we just do it. We were doing it for a long time before. We've done it lots of places around the world. I mean, I can't say very much about this, or I wouldn't be able to pass my next polygraph. But you know, covert action is one of the main missions of the Central Intelligence Agency. You know, it was, for example, I forget which organization, the Special Forces, the 6 something or other of the Special Forces, who were actually on the ground in the Bin Laden takedown, but the command and control link. Oh, and we all saw the picture. Matter of fact, some of you may remember I used it in my first presentation to you of the room full of people in the Situation Room during that takedown. But the command and control wasn't. They were just watchers. The command and control wasn't coming from the Situation Room in the White House. It was coming from CIA. It was Leon Panetta who was essentially giving the overall guidance. I mean, the military at the level of execution, you know, the on-site commanders were the ones doing it, but the overall conduct of that operation was under the direction of the CIA. So Dave, I think the construct for doing it with CIA is already in place. It's been demonstrated many times over. I have no data, let me be clear. I have no specific information at this moment, but I would guess that it's still in place and operating there now. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That is a superb presentation. And beginning gave a lot of facts about the country and about the makeup of the country.
Yes.
That was really very helpful.
Oh, yeah.
So you've done a lot of homework. Appreciate that.
Oh, yeah.
I have always done lots of homework in these presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the hard work.
You are a fun audience.
So, So next Sunday, our presentation will be about the history, this is by Reverend Matthew Boss. Halloween has a religious history going back centuries. And he will share some of that history with us next week.
Okay.
So
Do we have to wear costumes?
that's all.
Oh, wow.
You're allowed to.
Will he be passing out candy?
Yeah.
There's a woman.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Wonderful.